Hello, and welcome to the channel. The story you're about to hear is about a man who saved a nation by holding it together through its darkest hour, only to die just as the light was breaking. It's a story about how a Kentucky farm boy with less than a year of formal schooling became the author of America's second founding. And it begins, as all great American tragedies must, with a death that felt like the end of everything. The rain had been falling since midnight, a cold April rain that turned the streets of Washington into rivers of mud. By dawn on April 15th, 1865, the unpaved length of 10th Street had become a dark channel reflecting the gray sky, and the crowd that had gathered outside a narrow boarding house across from Ford's Theater stood in it, hats in hands, weeping openly in the downpour. Inside the Peterson house, in a cramped bedroom at the back of the first floor, Abraham Lincoln was dying. He had been dying for 9 hours now, ever since John Wilkes Booth's bullet had torn through the back of his skull at 10:15 the previous night. The room was small, barely 10 feet wide, and it was filled with witnesses to the end of an era. They had carried him here because he could not be moved farther. 6 men had lifted his impossibly long frame, 6 feet 4 inches of Kentucky bone and prairie muscle, and carried him across the muddy street, his feet dragging, his arms hanging limp, blood trailing behind them in the lamplight. They had tried to lay him on the bed, but the bed was too short. Of course it was too short. Lincoln had spent his entire life in beds too short, at tables too low, in rooms too small for his frame. Now, in death, as in life, he had to be positioned diagonally, his knees slightly bent, his great shoulders twisted to fit within the boundaries others had built. The room smelled of blood and burning coal oil. A dim gaslight flickered on the wallpaper, cheap boarding house wallpaper, brown and repeating, the kind of pattern that crowds in on you in small spaces. In the hallway beyond the door, Mary Todd Lincoln's screams had finally subsided into a terrible, rhythmic sobbing. She had been allowed in twice during the night, and twice she had collapsed at the sight of him. "Live! You must live!" she had shrieked, shaking him as though she could wake him from this final sleep. Now they kept her in the front parlor, and her grief echoed through the house like something trapped and dying. Lincoln's breathing had changed as dawn approached. All night it had been labored, rasping, the sound of a man drowning in his own blood. Dr. Charles Leal, 23 years old, and the first physician to reach the president after the shooting, had kept his finger on Lincoln's pulse through the dark hours, monitoring the slow diminishment of life. The bullet had done its work with terrible precision. It had entered behind the left ear, tunneled through the brain, and lodged behind the right eye. There was no possibility of survival. There was only the waiting. Around the bed stood the witnesses. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, his face streaked with tears, had spent the night conducting the investigation and the death watch simultaneously, taking testimony from witnesses while the president lay dying 6 feet away. Stanton, who had once called Lincoln a long-armed ape, who had mocked his frontier manners and his endless stories, now wept openly and without shame. Next to him stood Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, his wig slightly askew, making notes in a small leather journal, because that was what men did when they didn't know what else to do. Senator Charles Sumner sat at the head of the bed, holding Lincoln's hand, bending close to whisper words the president could no longer hear. Robert Lincoln, the eldest son, stood near the door, 21 years old and frozen in the posture of a man trying not to break. He had been summoned from the White House shortly after midnight. His younger brother Tad, 12 years old, had been told that his father was sick, but would be fine. "They killed Papa dead," Tad would wail when the truth could no longer be hidden. But in this moment, in this room, Robert stood alone with his grief, watching his father die by inches in a stranger's bed. The physicians checked the pulse every few minutes. It was weakening. Lincoln's face had gone pale, then grey, then something beyond grey, a color that had no name, the color of departure. His breathing grew more irregular. Sometimes it stopped entirely, and the room held its collective breath, only to release it when Lincoln drew another shuddering gasp. This happened again and again. Each time, those gathered thought it was the end. Each time, Lincoln insisted on one more breath. Outside, the rain continued. The crowd in the street had grown to hundreds now, people standing in the mud, waiting for news they already knew was coming. Soldiers formed a cordon to keep the curious at bay. Newspaper correspondents huddled under awnings, their notebooks growing damp, writing the first draft of a history that would be rewritten 1,000 times. At 7:21 in the morning, Lincoln's breathing stopped. The room held perfectly still. Dr. Liel felt for the pulse. Nothing. He lifted Lincoln's eyelids and examined the eyes that had seen so much, read so many books by firelight, wept for so many dead soldiers. The pupils were fixed and dilated. The president's face, in death, looked younger somehow, the deep lines of care smoothed away, the melancholy that had always haunted those eyes, finally at rest. Edwin Stanton stood, removed his glasses, and wiped them carefully on his handkerchief. The room waited. Outside, a church bell began to toll, though no one had yet told the sexton that the president was gone. Stanton cleared his throat, put his glasses back on, and spoke the words that would echo through history. "Now, he belongs to the ages." The rain drummed on the roof of the Peterson house. In the front parlor, Mary Todd Lincoln began to scream again, the sound of a woman losing her mind in real time. In the street, the crowd sensed the change, and a moan went up, a collective sound of grief that spread block by block through the city. The war was over, the Union was saved, and the man who had saved it was dead at 56 years old, killed by an actor with a derringer and a dream of Southern glory. But to understand how this Kentucky farm boy came to this room, how a man with almost no formal education became the author of the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation, how a melancholic frontier lawyer held a fracturing nation together through 4 years of the bloodiest war in American history, we must go back. Back beyond the war, beyond the presidency, beyond even the famous debates and speeches. We must go back to the beginning, to a log cabin in the Kentucky wilderness, to the silence and poverty and hunger that shaped everything that would follow. The boy who would save the Union was born in a hole in the ground. That's not quite accurate, but it's not quite wrong either. On February the 12th, 1809, in a one-room log cabin near Hodgenville, Kentucky, Nancy Hanks Lincoln gave birth to her second child in a structure that was less a house than a shelter against the wilderness. The cabin measured 16 feet by 18 feet. It had a dirt floor, one small window covered with greased paper instead of glass, and a door made of split logs hung on leather hinges. There was no doctor. There were no neighbors near enough to help. There was only Thomas Lincoln, Nancy, their 2-year-old daughter Sarah, and the Kentucky winter pressing in through the gaps in the logs. They called the farm Sinking Spring, after the natural spring that bubbled up from the limestone rock 300 yards from the cabin. Thomas Lincoln had paid $200 for 300 acres, which tells you everything about the quality of the land. In Kentucky in 1809, good land commanded much higher prices. This was leftover land, the sort of property a man bought when he had more hope than money. Thomas Lincoln was a man acquainted with loss. His father, also named Abraham, had been killed by Indians in 1786 while clearing land in Kentucky, shot down in front of his 3 sons. Thomas had been 8 years old, watching his father die in a field he'd been trying to tame. That kind of violence leaves a mark. It shapes how you see the world, how much you trust in permanence or progress. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was, if anything, even more mysterious. She was illegitimate, born to Lucy Hanks in Virginia under circumstances that polite society didn't discuss. She could read, which was unusual for a woman of her class and time. She was deeply religious, a member of the Little Mount Baptist Church, one of those frontier congregations that preached a spare, unadorned Christianity, stripped of all hierarchy and ornament. She was tall, thin, and by all accounts possessed of a deep melancholy that she would pass on to her son like a genetic inheritance. The boy they named Abraham grew up in silence, not the peaceful silence of meditation, but the heavy silence of poverty, of isolation, of long winter nights with nothing to burn but green wood that filled the cabin with smoke, the silence of empty bellies, the silence of a father who worked himself to exhaustion, clearing land that would never quite yield enough, the silence of a mother who read her Bible by firelight and told her children stories from its pages because there were no other books, no other stories, nothing but the wilderness and the Word. Lincoln would later say he remembered almost nothing of Kentucky. This is probably a lie, or at least a strategic forgetting. But certain images must have lodged in that remarkable brain of his. The taste of wild game and corn mush, eaten day after day because there was nothing else. The feel of a dirt floor under bare feet, always slightly damp, always cold. The sound of his father's axe against wood, that rhythm that marked frontier time as surely as any clock. And there would have been other sights, darker ones, that a boy of 6 or 7 would not have fully understood, but could never entirely forget. Kentucky was a slave state, and the roads that passed near Sinking Spring Farm sometimes carried coffles of enslaved people being moved south to the cotton plantations. A coffle was a line of human beings chained together at the neck or wrist, driven like livestock by white men on horseback. Lincoln would have seen them. The sound of chains, the exhausted shuffle of people who had walked too far, the terrible silence of the enslaved, a silence different from the poverty silence Lincoln knew, a silence enforced by violence and the threat of violence. In 1816, when Abraham was 7, Thomas Lincoln decided to leave Kentucky. The land titles were a tangled mess, Claims overlapped, surveys conflicted, and a poor man could farm land for years only to discover he'd never legally owned it at all. Then there was the slavery question. Thomas and Nancy were members of a Baptist congregation that had split over the issue. Indiana, newly opened for settlement, was free territory under the Northwest Ordinance. A man could own land there with clear title. So in December of 1816, the Lincolns packed what little they owned onto 2 horses and walked north. Abraham, 7 years old, helped drive the animals. They crossed the Ohio River on a crude ferry, leaving slave territory for free. They walked 100 miles through wilderness, following traces that were barely paths, sleeping in camps, living on wild game. Thomas shot along the way. The new farm in southern Indiana was even more primitive than Sinking Spring had been. For the first weeks, they lived in a 3-sided lean-to, open to the weather on one side, while Thomas and young Abraham began the work of clearing land and building a cabin. This was the real frontier. Bears and wolves prowled at night. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Winter was coming, and they were living in a shelter that couldn't keep out the wind. But Abraham had his mother, and Nancy had her Bible. And at night, she would read to her children by the light of the fire. She read them the stories of Moses and David, of prophets and kings, of ordinary people called to do extraordinary things. She taught Abraham his letters, showed him how sounds became words, how words unlocked meaning. In a world of almost unimaginable material poverty, she gave him the gift of language. In 1818, the milk sickness came to Little Pigeon Creek. It arrived in late summer, carried by cows that had eaten white snake root growing in the forest. The toxin passed through the milk into the humans who drank it. The symptoms began with weakness and nausea, progressed to terrible pain, and ended in death. There was no cure because no one understood the cause. When it came to a settlement, all you could do was wait and see who it would take. It took Nancy Hanks Lincoln in October. She was 34 years old. The sickness lasted a week. Abraham, 9 years old, watched his mother die in the same pole bed where she had given birth to him. He watched her grow weaker, watched the pain consume her, watched her slip away despite every prayer and desperate plea. Thomas built the coffin himself, planing the boards as best he could. Abraham whittled the pegs that held it together. There was no minister available, so they buried Nancy on a hill near the cabin without proper ceremony, just a pile of stones to mark the place. Years later, Lincoln would say almost nothing about his mother's death, but those who knew him best recognized the shadow it cast. The melancholy that would plague him all his life, the terrible depressions he called the hypo, the sense of impermanence that made him hold everything with a loose grip because he knew how quickly it could be lost. All of that began on a hill in Indiana, at a grave marked with rough stones, when a 9-year-old boy learned that the people you love most can simply stop existing. For more than a year, Thomas, Abraham, and Sarah lived alone in the cabin. Sarah, 11 years old, became the woman of the house. Abraham grew quieter, more withdrawn. Thomas sank into his own silence. The cabin became a place of ghosts. Then, in the winter of 1819, Thomas Lincoln did something that would change everything. He traveled back to Kentucky and married Sarah Bush Johnston, A widow with 3 children of her own, he brought his new family back to Indiana in a wagon loaded with furniture, cookware, and, most precious of all, books. Sarah Bush Lincoln took one look at the filthy, ragged children living in that primitive cabin and set to work. She scrubbed them, clothed them, fed them properly. She brought order and warmth and something like joy back into a house that had known only survival. But more than that, she brought books. A Bible, of course, but also Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, Aesop's Fables, a book of Arabian Nights. To a boy who had discovered reading through his mother's Bible, who had learned to hunger for words the way his body hungered for food, these books were treasure beyond measure. Abraham devoured them. He read by firelight at night until Thomas complained about wasting candles. He read while walking to fetch water. He copied passages into copybooks made from scraped boards when he had no paper. He read each book again and again until he had memorized whole passages, until the rhythms of their sentences became the rhythms of his own thought. Sarah Bush Lincoln understood what Thomas could not, that this strange, melancholic boy was different, that his mind was his fortune, that trying to make him into an ordinary farmer would be like trying to cage lightning. She protected his reading time. She encouraged his education. She loved him simply and completely in a way that helped heal the wound Nancy's death had left. But the wound never entirely closed. In later years, Lincoln would say almost nothing about Nancy Hanks Lincoln, would barely mention her name. He would speak warmly of his stepmother, would call her his angel mother. But the first mother, the one who taught him to read, the one who died when he was 9, her absence shaped him as surely as her presence had. It taught him that love ends, that mothers die, that nothing is permanent. It prepared him in ways he couldn't know for all the loss that was still to come. Abraham Lincoln grew up with an axe in his hands. From age 7 to age 21, he spent most of his waking hours clearing land in the Indiana wilderness. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal truth of his adolescence. Trees had to be felled, stumps had to be grubbed out, brush had to be burned, and all of it had to be done by hand, by muscle, by the simple, brutal mathematics of human effort against an indifferent forest. A good worker could clear perhaps an acre in a year. Thomas Lincoln's farm was 160 acres of virgin timber. The work shaped the boy's body in ways that would mark him for life. By his mid-teens, Abraham stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, impossibly lanky, all arms and legs and awkward angles. His hands were enormous, his reach astonishing. He could sink an axe blade deeper than any man in the county, could split rails all day without tiring, could lift weights that other men wouldn't attempt. There are stories, perhaps exaggerated, perhaps not, of young Lincoln carrying logs that required 3 normal men to lift, of him hoisting a chicken coop by himself and walking it to a new location. But the strength came wrapped in an ungainly package. He was grotesquely thin despite the heavy labor, his joints prominent, his movements somehow both powerful and awkward. His face was homely by any conventional standard. Deep-set eyes under heavy brows, prominent nose, large ears, a complexion darkened by constant outdoor work. Later in life, when a political opponent called him two-faced, Lincoln would respond, "If I had another face, Do you think I would wear this one? Yet there was something about him that drew people. Perhaps it was the stories. Lincoln had discovered early that he could hold an audience, that he had a gift for mimicry and narrative, for shaping experience into entertainment. After a day in the fields, men would gather around fires, and young Lincoln would recount something he'd read or heard, acting out all the parts, changing his voice for different characters, finding the comedy or tragedy in everyday events. People would walk miles to hear him speak. The stories were a kind of currency on the frontier, where books were scarce and news scarcer still. But they were also something more, a way of processing the world, of finding meaning in hardship, of creating community through shared laughter. Lincoln was building a skill he didn't know he'd need, learning to move people with words. In 1826, when Abraham was 17, his sister Sarah married Aaron Grigsby, a neighboring farmer. She was 19. On January the 20th, 1828, Sarah Lincoln Grigsby died, giving birth to her first child. She was 20 years old. The baby died with her. Abraham was 19, and for the second time in his life, he watched someone he loved disappear into the Indiana earth. Sarah had been his companion through all the hard years, his ally in the lonely cabin after their mother died. He blamed the Grigsby family for her death, blamed them for not calling a doctor sooner, for letting her die. He wrote a cruel satirical piece about the Grigsbys that circulated in the community, mocking them in their grief. It was petty and mean, and later he would be ashamed of it. But grief does strange things to people. That spring, still raw from his sister's death, Lincoln made his first journey down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. A local merchant named James Gentry hired him to help his son Allen take a flatboat loaded with produce down to the southern markets. For a farm boy who had never been more than 20 miles from home, it must have seemed like a journey to another world. The flatboat was a crude vessel, essentially a large raft with sides, steered by long oars and dependent on the current to carry it downstream. Lincoln and Gentry loaded it with pork, corn, and flour, then pushed off into the Ohio River. They drifted through a landscape that opened before them like pages in a book, past settlements and wilderness, past the confluence where the Ohio joined the Mississippi, into the great river itself, that rolling highway of brown water carrying half a continent toward the sea. The journey took 3 months. They were attacked by river pirates one night, fought them off with poles and clubs. They navigated through snags and sawyers, those deadly submerged trees that could gut a flatboat in seconds. They saw cities, steamboats, plantations stretching back from the river like kingdoms. And then they reached New Orleans, and Lincoln saw slavery in its full industrial horror. New Orleans in 1828 was the great port of the South, and the slave market was where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. The market was located near the river, in open pens and auction houses. Lincoln would have seen it all. The inspection process, where potential buyers examined enslaved people's teeth, muscles, backs. The auction block, where families were separated, children sold away from mothers, husbands from wives. The casual violence, the whips and chains, the absolute commodification of human flesh. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, that Lincoln and his companions witnessed a slave auction, and that Lincoln said then, "If I ever get a chance to hit that thing, I'll hit it hard." Whether he said exactly those words, we cannot know. But something in New Orleans marked him. He saw what slavery really was, saw it not as an abstract political question, but as a concrete reality of suffering. The sight lodged in his mind like a splinter, waiting for the day when he would have the power to extract it. 3 years later, in 1831, Lincoln made a second flatboat journey to New Orleans, this time for a merchant named Denton Offord. By now he was 22, broader in the shoulders, more confident in his abilities. On this journey, the flatboat got stuck on a mill dam near New Salem, Illinois. Lincoln devised an ingenious solution, drilling a hole in the boat to let water drain out, then plugging it once the boat floated free. Offord was impressed. He offered Lincoln a job clerking in a store he planned to open in New Salem. But before Lincoln could settle into his new life, there was the matter of his reputation to establish. New Salem had its own champion wrestler, a man named Jack Armstrong, leader of a rough crew called the Clary's Grove Boys. They liked to test newcomers, and they demanded that Lincoln wrestle their champion. The match became legendary in the telling and retelling. By most accounts, it was a brutal affair, with Lincoln's height and reach countered by Armstrong's thickness and experience. They grappled for what seemed like hours, neither able to gain decisive advantage. Some versions say Lincoln finally threw Armstrong cleanly. Others say Armstrong's friends interfered, and Lincoln offered to fight them all, one at a time or together. It didn't matter to him. What matters is that afterward, Jack Armstrong became Lincoln's friend and defender, and the Clary's Grove Boys became his loyal supporters. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout Lincoln's life. Initial confrontation, leading to respect, leading to loyalty. He had a gift for turning adversaries into allies, for fighting hard and then extending his hand to the man he'd beaten. In the rough democracy of the frontier, where a man's worth was measured in his strength and his word, Lincoln had proven himself. He was 22 years old, newly arrived in New Salem, Illinois, with no prospects beyond a clerk's job in a country store. He owned almost nothing, a few books, the clothes on his back, debts from his father's failed ventures that he felt honor-bound to repay even though they weren't legally his. He was awkward, homely, largely self-educated, with no connections and no fortune. But he had words. He had stories. He had a mind that could absorb anything it encountered and reshape it into something useful. He had the respect of hard men who didn't give respect easily. And somewhere in that angular frame, in that melancholic heart, there was an ambition that even he didn't yet fully understand, a sense that he was meant for something more than splitting rails and running a store in a town of 25 families. The New Orleans slave market haunted him. The sight of human beings in chains, of families torn apart on auction blocks, of the efficient brutality of the trade, these images would stay with him. Years later, when he had the power to act, he would remember what he had seen on those trips down the river. He would remember the promise he had made, whether aloud or only to himself, that if he ever got the chance to hit that thing, he would hit it hard. The river had shown him a wider world. Now, he would begin the long work of finding his place in it. New Salem, Illinois, in 1831, was barely a village. 25 families clustered around a mill on the Sangamon River, a place so new that stumps still dotted the main street. It was the kind of settlement that appeared overnight on the American frontier and often disappeared just as quickly when the land played out or the mill failed or people simply moved on to the next promised place. Lincoln arrived there with nothing, and in 6 years he would leave with everything that mattered: an education, a profession, and a grief so profound it nearly destroyed him. He started as a clerk in Denton Offutt's store, selling calico and whiskey and whatever else frontier people needed. Offutt was a big talker, full of schemes and enthusiasm, and the store failed within a year, as most of Offutt's schemes did. Lincoln found himself unemployed in a village of 100 people, with no prospects and mounting debts. So he did what ambitious young men on the frontier did. He ran for the state legislature. He lost. It was 1832. He was 23 years old, and he received 277 votes out of 300 cast in New Salem itself, which tells you something about how the village had taken to this strange storytelling giant. But New Salem was only one precinct in a large district, and elsewhere, where people didn't know him, his lack of education and connections showed. He finished 8th out of 13 candidates. The loss barely slowed him down. That same year, the Black Hawk War broke out, and Lincoln volunteered for the militia. He was elected captain of his company, his first electoral success, though he would later joke that his military career consisted mainly of fighting mosquitoes and not finding any Indians. He served for 3 months, saw no combat, and returned to New Salem more in debt than when he left. So he became a surveyor. He borrowed books on mathematics and surveying, taught himself the principles and the use of instruments, and hired himself out to map the land that settlers were claiming from the prairie. It was solitary work, walking property lines, making calculations, sleeping rough. But it paid slowly, and it gave him time to think, to read, to continue the education he was cobbling together from borrowed books and fierce determination. He borrowed a grammar book from a schoolmaster named Mentor Graham and studied it by candlelight until he could pass sentences and identify parts of speech. This might seem like a small thing, but it was everything. Lincoln had taught himself to read as a child, but reading and writing well are different skills entirely. Grammar gave him the architecture of language, showed him how sentences were built, how ideas could be structured and deployed with precision. He would walk 6 miles to borrow a book, read it through the night, walk 6 miles back to return it and borrow another. The people of New Salem watched this transformation with a mixture of amusement and respect. Here was a man who could split more rails in a day than any 3 normal men, who could tell stories that made you forget your troubles, who was studying grammar and surveying and law in a frontier village where most people could barely read. He was odd, certainly, but he was their odd one, and they were proud of him in the way small communities are proud of the person who reaches beyond what seems possible. In 1834, Lincoln ran for the legislature again, and this time, he won. He was 25 years old, and he borrowed money to buy his first suit, a proper suit, not the rough clothes he'd worn all his life. He began studying law in earnest now, borrowing books from John Todd Stewart, an attorney in Springfield who had served with Lincoln in the Black Hawk War. Stewart saw something in the awkward young legislator, some quality of mind that transcended the rough exterior. But it was in New Salem, during these years of transformation, that Lincoln encountered the great sorrow that would mark him forever. Her name was Anne Rutledge. She was the daughter of the tavern keeper, 22 years old when Lincoln knew her, with red hair and a gentle manner that people remembered decades later. The details of their relationship are murky. Did they court? Were they engaged? Did she love him? Or was she still promised to another man who had left New Salem and never returned? The evidence is thin, the testimony conflicting, obscured by time and by Lincoln's own silence on the subject. What we know for certain is this. In August of 1835, typhoid fever came to New Salem, and Anne Rutledge died. She was 22 years old. The sickness took her in a week, the same terrible progression Lincoln had seen before. Fever, delirium, the body consuming itself. He sat with her in those final days, or so the stories say. He watched another person he loved slip away beyond the reach of any effort or prayer or desperate wish. And when she died, something in Lincoln broke. The breakdown lasted for weeks. Friends feared he would take his own life. He wandered the woods around New Salem, talking to himself, unable to sleep or eat or focus on anything beyond his grief. The melancholy that had always shadowed him descended like a fog, and he nearly disappeared into it. His friends kept watch, removed razors and knives from his reach, walked with him through the darkest hours. Slowly, painfully, he emerged. But he was changed. The humor remained, the storytelling, the ambition. But there was a darkness underneath now that never entirely lifted. He would battle depression for the rest of his life, would call it the hypo, would live with the knowledge that the fog could descend at any time and swallow him whole. Those who knew him best said he seemed to carry a great sadness, even in moments of triumph, as though some part of him remained in that New Salem cemetery, at another grave marked with stones. He threw himself into work, into law books and legislative sessions, and the endless project of self-improvement. He read Blackstone's commentaries, the foundational text of English common law, walking the roads around New Salem with the book in his hands, reading aloud to fix the concepts in his mind. He read Euclid's Elements to train himself in logical reasoning. He read poetry and Shakespeare and the Bible, absorbing not just information, but style, rhythm, the architecture of persuasion. In January of 1838, Lincoln delivered an address to the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield. He was 28 years old, and the speech revealed a mind that had moved far beyond the frontier village where he'd started. He spoke about the perpetuation of political institutions, about the dangers of mob rule, about the need for reverence for the law. But beneath the formal language, you can hear something deeper. A man working through trauma, trying to understand how civilization holds itself together when passion threatens to tear it apart. Passion has helped us, he said, but can do so no more. It will, in future, be our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. It was the speech of a man who had learned, at terrible cost, what happens when feeling overwhelms sense, when grief clouds judgment. It was Lincoln beginning to articulate the philosophy that would guide him through the coming storms. By 1837, he had passed the bar and formed a partnership with John Todd Stewart in Springfield. New Salem was already dying. The mill had failed. Families were moving away. The village that had seemed so promising was returning to prairie. Lincoln packed his few belongings in saddlebags and rode to Springfield, the new state capital, to begin his career as a lawyer and legislator. He arrived with debts, a borrowed horse, and a mind educated through sheer force of will. He had taught himself grammar, surveying, law, and philosophy. He had loved and lost and survived the losing. He had learned that grief was something you carried, not something you cured, and that work was the only reliable defense against the darkness. He was 28 years old, and the real education, the one that would prepare him to save a nation, was about to begin. Springfield in 1837 was a muddy crossroads trying to become a capital. The legislature had voted to move the seat of government from Vandalia, and suddenly this town of 1,500 souls was filling with lawyers and politicians and office seekers. Lincoln arrived with his possessions in saddlebags, walked into a general store, and asked about lodging. The proprietor, Joshua Speed, took one look at this ungainly figure and offered to share his room above the store. Lincoln carried his bags upstairs, came back down, and said simply, "Well, Speed, I'm moved." He threw himself into the law with the same fierce concentration he'd brought to everything else. He rode the 8th Judicial Circuit, a loop of county seats covering thousands of square miles, staying in rough taverns, trying cases in primitive courtrooms, building a reputation as a lawyer who could sway juries with stories and logic in equal measure. He would arrive in a town, entertain the locals with his tales, then destroy opposing counsel in court the next morning. The other lawyers on the circuit became his companions, his education, his community. But it was in Springfield's parlors, not its courtrooms, that Lincoln met his fate. Mary Todd arrived in Springfield in 1839 to live with her sister. She was 21 years old, daughter of a prominent Kentucky family, educated at finishing schools, fluent in French, sharp-tongued and ambitious. Where Lincoln had clawed his way up from nothing, Mary had stepped down from comfort to marry potential rather than wealth. She was short and plump, where Lincoln was tall and gaunt. She was volatile, where he was melancholic. She loved parties and politics and fine things. He was indifferent to social niceties and wore suits that never quite fit. But they shared something crucial: ambition. Mary Todd wanted to be the wife of a president. Abraham Lincoln wanted to be worth being. They courted through 1840, an unlikely pair that fascinated and confused Springfield society. By late 1840, they were engaged to be married. And then, on January 1st, 1841, Lincoln broke the engagement. We don't know exactly why. The historical record is murky, obscured by Lincoln's silence and Mary's later embellishments. Perhaps he got cold feet, overwhelmed by the prospect of marriage. Perhaps Mary released him from the engagement. Perhaps there was another woman involved. What we know is that the engagement ended and Lincoln collapsed into the worst depression of his life. He called it the fatal 1st of January. For weeks, he was unable to work. barely able to function. He wrote to his law partner that he was the most miserable man living, and that if his feelings were distributed to the entire human family, there would not be one cheerful face on earth. His friends feared, once again, that he might take his own life. Joshua Speed, his closest friend, pulled him through. Speed was going through his own romantic crisis, and the two men wrote to each other about fear and marriage and the risk of commitment. Slowly, painfully, Lincoln emerged from the darkness, and slowly, secretly, he and Mary began to see each other again. On November the 4th, 1842, with almost no warning, they were married. The ceremony was small, held in the parlor of Mary's sister's house. Lincoln stood there in a new suit, allegedly looking like a man going to slaughter, and when asked where he was going, replied, "To hell, I suppose." It was the kind of joke that wasn't entirely a joke, the kind of dark humor that would characterize their marriage. It was a partnership of equals, which was rare enough in that era. Mary managed the household, raised the children, and pushed Lincoln's political career with a fierce determination that sometimes embarrassed him. She had a terrible temper, would throw things, scream at servants, create scenes that mortified her quiet husband. But she also had a brilliant political mind, could analyze men and situations with devastating accuracy, and believed in Lincoln's destiny with a certainty he often lacked himself. Lincoln, for his part, was a gentle husband and a besotted father. When Robert Todd Lincoln was born in August 1843, this rough frontier lawyer transformed into something tender and awkward. He would let the baby pull his hair, would walk the floor with Robert for hours, would neglect his work to play with his son. Mary, who had been raised in a household with slaves to manage the children, found his indulgence excessive. But Lincoln couldn't help himself. Fatherhood unlocked something in him, perhaps a chance to give the affection his own father had withheld. Edward Baker. Lincoln arrived in March 1846, named for Lincoln's political friend. Now there were two boys in the house on 8th and Jackson, and Lincoln's law practice suffered from his tendency to let them run wild in his office, scattering papers and interrupting clients. Other lawyers complained. Mary fumed. Lincoln just smiled his sad smile and let the boys climb on him like a tree. But ambition called louder than domestic peace. In 1846, Lincoln ran for Congress as a Whig and won. In December 1847, he took his seat in the House of Representatives, bringing Mary and the boys to Washington. He was 38 years old, and this was his chance to make his mark on the national stage. He made his mark, but not in the way he'd hoped. The Mexican War was raging, and President Polk claimed Mexico had invaded American territory and shed American blood on American soil. Lincoln wasn't convinced. He introduced his spot resolutions, demanding that Polk identify the exact spot where American blood had been shed, implying that the war was one of aggression, disguised as defense. It was a principled stand, a lawyer's argument demanding evidence for inflammatory claims. It was also political suicide. Illinois was proud of its soldiers fighting in Mexico. Lincoln's constituents saw his opposition as betrayal, as undermining troops in the field. The Democratic newspapers savaged him as unpatriotic. Even his own party grew uncomfortable with his intransigence. He had come to Congress to build a national reputation, and he'd succeeded. He was now known as a critic, a naysayer, someone who put abstract principles above practical politics. He served his single term and kept his promise not to run for re-election. In 1849, he returned to Springfield, his political career apparently finished. He was 40 years old, a former congressman with no prospects, a lawyer who would have to rebuild his practice from scratch. Mary was furious. She had married potential, and potential seemed to be draining away like water through cupped hands. Lincoln went back to riding the circuit, trying cases, telling stories in country taverns. He was good at it, successful enough to provide for his family, respected among his peers. But something in him had gone quiet. The ambition that had driven him from the Indiana wilderness to the halls of Congress seemed exhausted, spent. He focused on his law practice, on his children, on the small satisfactions of daily life. He had no way of knowing that his political wilderness was just preparation, that the stand he'd taken against the Mexican War, the insistence that aggression be called aggression, that expansion not be confused with defense, was training for battles yet to come. He had no way of knowing that in just a few years, another question of expansion, another debate about the nature of American territory would pull him back into politics with a force he couldn't resist. For now, he was just a failed politician in a muddy capital, married to a woman who dreamed bigger than he dared, father to 2 boys he loved with helpless tenderness, carrying his melancholy like a familiar coat through the predictable rounds of a lawyer's life. The house on 8th and Jackson held laughter and fury, tenderness and ambition, hope and disappointment in equal measure. It was an ordinary life, except for the extraordinary hungers that lived within it, waiting for the moment when history would call and Lincoln would have no choice but to answer. The wilderness stretched ahead, longer than he knew. The years between 1849 and 1854 were the quietest of Lincoln's adult life, and perhaps the saddest. He returned from Washington to Springfield, a political failure, 40 years old, with a wife who had expected greatness and 2 young sons who needed feeding. He had gambled on national politics and lost. Now there was nothing to do but practice law and pretend that ambition had been satisfied, that a country practice in Illinois was enough for a man who had once walked the halls of Congress. He was very good at the law, better than good. By the early 1850s, Lincoln had become one of the most sought-after attorneys in Illinois, particularly for railroad cases. The railroads were spreading across the prairie like iron veins, and they needed lawyers who understood both the technical details of right-of-way disputes and the emotional tenor of juries who distrusted corporate power. Lincoln could do both. He could explain complicated survey maps to farmers, then turn around and argue points of corporate law with precision that impressed judges trained in Eastern law schools. The Illinois Central Railroad became his most important client. He represented them in dozens of cases, earning fees that finally gave his family real financial security. In one case, he successfully defended the railroad's tax exemption, saving them enormous sums. When they tried to shortchange him on the fee, he sued them and won $5,000, more money than he'd ever seen at once. Mary could finally furnish their house properly, could hire help, could hold her head up in Springfield society. But the work that made Lincoln's reputation wasn't the corporate cases. It was the murder trials, the land disputes, the small human dramas that played out in frontier courtrooms. He developed a style that juries loved: plain-speaking, homely metaphors, strategic uses of humor to deflate opposing counsel's pomposity. He never talked down to jurors, never tried to dazzle them with legal Latin. Instead, he told stories. He made them see the case through his client's eyes, feel what his client felt, understand that justice wasn't an abstract concept, but a human necessity. Other lawyers noticed something else about Lincoln. He wouldn't take a case unless he believed in it. If a potential client came to him with what Lincoln considered an unjust claim, he would refuse the business, even when he needed the money. It built a reputation. People said "Honest Abe" and meant it literally. If Lincoln took your case, it meant something. If he said something in court, juries believed it because they knew he wouldn't lie. He cultivated strategic silence on controversial topics. When other lawyers argued politics in taverns, Lincoln would tell a story instead, deflecting rather than declaring. When asked his position on slavery in casual conversation, he would change the subject or respond with studied vagueness. He was building something, a reputation for fairness, for reasonableness, for being a man who could be trusted even by those who disagreed with him. He didn't know yet what he was building it for. Then, in February of 1850, Eddie Lincoln died. Edward Baker Lincoln was 3 years old. He had been sick for 52 days, probably tuberculosis, though the doctors called it consumption, and had no cure to offer. Lincoln and Mary watched their second son waste away, watched him cough and struggle and slowly suffocate. They took turns sitting with him through the long nights. They prayed, though Lincoln's faith was as complicated and melancholic as everything else about him. They did everything parents could do, which was nothing, which was wait and watch and hope against evidence. On February the 1st, Eddie died. They buried him in Hutchinson's Cemetery in Springfield, and something broke in Mary Todd Lincoln that would never entirely heal. She had already lost 3 siblings, had watched her mother die when she was 6. Now she had lost a child, and the grief drove her to the edge of madness. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop weeping. She would stand at Eddie's grave for hours, talking to him, refusing to come inside even when Lincoln begged her. Lincoln carried his grief differently, the way he always had, into silence, into work, into that deep interior place where his melancholy lived. But he also carried Mary's grief, tried to hold her together, even as his own sorrow threatened to drown him. The marriage, never easy, became a daily battle against despair. Mary's temper, always volatile, became explosive. Lincoln's silence, always deep, became impenetrable. They were 2 people drowning in the same ocean, unable to save each other. 10 months after Eddie died, Mary gave birth to another son. They named him William Wallace Lincoln, called him Willie. It was too soon, perhaps. Grief demands more time than 10 months. But Willie was a beautiful child, bright and affectionate, and he gave Mary something to live for beyond the grave in Hutchinson's Cemetery. Lincoln adored him with the same fierce tenderness he'd shown Robert and Eddie. But there was something special about Willie. He was gentle like his father, curious, bookish even as a small child. Lincoln would read to him for hours, teach him stories and poems, find in this boy a companionship he'd never quite achieved with the more distant Robert. In 1853, Mary gave birth to Thomas, called Tad because his large head made him look like a tadpole. Tad had a cleft palate that made his speech difficult to understand, and he was wild in ways that Willie was gentle. But Lincoln loved him with the same helpless devotion, let him run riot through the law office, indulged his pranks and tantrums in ways that drove Mary to distraction. The house on 8th and Jackson filled with noise. Again, children playing, Mary entertaining, Lincoln telling stories to visitors who came to consult the successful lawyer. From the outside, it looked like prosperity, like a man who had found his place. Lincoln's practice was thriving. His income reached several $1,000s a year, real wealth by frontier standards. He bought property, invested in land, provided for his family with a security he'd never known as a child. But inside, in the places that mattered, Lincoln was waiting. For what, he couldn't have said. The political ambition that had driven him seemed dead, killed by the failure of his congressional term. He had tried the national stage and been found wanting. Now he was a country lawyer, a good father, a difficult husband to a difficult wife, a man whose greatest days seemed behind him at 45. He rode the circuit each spring and fall, staying in the same rough taverns, trying cases in the same courthouses, telling the same stories to the same audiences. The other lawyers noticed that sometimes, late at night, Lincoln would fall into deep silences, staring into the fire with an expression of such profound sadness that they didn't dare interrupt. The melancholy that had always shadowed him seemed to deepen during these quiet years, as though some part of him knew that the waiting couldn't last forever. Eddie's grave remained a wound that wouldn't heal. Mary visited it obsessively. Lincoln carried the loss in silence, added it to the collection of griefs he bore. His mother, his sister, Anne Rutledge, now his son. He was becoming a catalogue of absences, a man defined as much by what he'd lost as by what he still held. In 1854, that waiting would end. A senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas would propose a law that would destroy the fragile peace between North and South, and Lincoln would discover that some silences cannot be maintained, that some injustices demand a response, regardless of political cost. But in these quiet years, he was just a lawyer, a father, a melancholic man carrying griefs old and new through the predictable rhythms of a prairie life. The storm was gathering. Lincoln felt it in his bones, in the same deep place where his sorrows lived. But for now, there was only the circuit, the courtroom, the boys playing in the yard, Mary's volatile affection, and the endless prairie stretching away under an indifferent sky. On May 30th, 1854, President Franklin Pierce signed into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Abraham Lincoln's political hibernation ended. He would later say, "I was losing interest in politics when the repeal of the Missouri Compromise aroused me again." It was a characteristic understatement. What the Kansas-Nebraska Act did was detonate the fragile compromise. that had held the Union together for 34 years. And what it did to Lincoln was reawaken an ambition and a moral clarity that 5 years of country lawyering had not quite extinguished. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn a line across the Western Territories. Slavery permitted south of 36°G30's latitude, forbidden north of it. It wasn't justice, but it was stability, a way of managing the nation's original sin without forcing a confrontation that might destroy the Republic. For a generation, politicians had treated this compromise as sacred, untouchable, the foundation upon which national peace rested. Stephen Douglas destroyed it in an afternoon. Douglas was Lincoln's great rival, though Douglas probably didn't know it yet. Where Lincoln was awkward and homely, Douglas was short and handsome, called the Little Giant for his outsized political presence. He was a senator from Illinois, a Democrat with presidential ambitions, a man who believed that the great questions of the day could be solved through procedural cleverness rather than moral reckoning. His Kansas-Nebraska Act proposed to organize the territories through popular sovereignty, letting the settlers themselves vote on whether to permit slavery, regardless of latitude lines or previous compromises. It was brilliant politics and catastrophic morality. What it did to the country was open a wound that had been carefully bandaged and invite both sides to fight over the bleeding territory. Lincoln read the act and felt something he hadn't felt in years, a clarity of purpose, an anger that burned away the melancholy fog. This wasn't a question of political expediency or party loyalty. This was a question of whether slavery would be allowed to spread across the continent, whether the United States would become a nation permanently divided between freedom and bondage, whether the promise of the Declaration of Independence meant anything at all. He began speaking against the act at gatherings across Illinois. At first, these were informal affairs, Lincoln responding to Douglas's speeches in the same towns. But as the summer of 1854 progressed, Lincoln's speeches grew longer, more detailed, more impassioned. He was working something out, articulating a philosophy of slavery and union that had been forming since he'd seen the slave markets of New Orleans 26 years earlier. On October 16, 1854, in Peoria, Illinois, Lincoln delivered what would become known simply as the Peoria speech. It lasted 3 hours. He had given a version of it in Springfield 12 days earlier, but at Peoria, he had refined it, sharpened it, turned it into something that witnesses described as the most powerful speech they had ever heard. He began with facts and history, laying out the Missouri Compromise and Douglas's betrayal of it. But then he moved beyond politics into morality. This declared indifference, but as I must think, covert real zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate, he said. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites. He acknowledged the complexity, didn't claim easy solutions. If all earthly power were given to him, he admitted he wouldn't know what to do with the existing institution. The honest confusion of a moral man facing an immoral system, so entrenched in law and custom and economic reality that simple justice seemed impossible. But then he found his moral center. When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government. That is despotism. If the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. The argument was simple, almost childishly so. But that was its power. Stripped of all the legal complexities and political compromises and economic arguments, slavery came down to this. Either the enslaved were human beings with natural rights, or they weren't. If they were, slavery was wrong. Period. All the sophisticated arguments about states' rights and popular sovereignty were just ways of avoiding this central, uncomfortable truth. The speech made Lincoln a figure in Illinois politics again. The new Republican Party, formed in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act from anti-slavery Whigs, Democrats, and Free Soilers, recognized in Lincoln a voice that could articulate their position with moral clarity and political sophistication. He wasn't an abolitionist calling for immediate emancipation. He wasn't a Southern apologist willing to let slavery spread. He was something else. A man who believed slavery was a moral wrong that must be contained, restricted, put on a path toward ultimate extinction, even if that path took generations. In 1856, the Republican Party held its first state convention in Bloomington, Illinois. Lincoln was chosen to give the closing speech. What happened next became part of Illinois legend. Lincoln spoke for over an hour and a half, building to a crescendo of moral argument and political vision that left the audience, including reporters who were supposed to be taking notes, so transfixed that they forgot to record his words. The speech was lost to history, remembered only as the lost speech. Eyewitnesses struggled to describe it afterward. They spoke of being held spellbound, of feeling the room electrified, of sensing that they were hearing something unprecedented, a merging of moral philosophy and political argument so powerful it seemed to transcend ordinary oratory. One man said Lincoln seemed 7 feet tall and inspired. Another said the speech convinced him that Lincoln was destined for greatness, though he couldn't explain exactly why. What Lincoln had done in Peoria and Bloomington and dozens of speeches across Illinois was crystallize a philosophy that would guide him through everything that followed. Slavery was a moral wrong, not a political preference, not a regional peculiarity, but an evil that contradicted the founding principles of the Republic. The Union was a sacred vessel for those principles, worth preserving even at terrible cost, because without the Union, the experiment in self-government would fail and the world would conclude that democracy was impossible. These two beliefs, slavery as moral wrong, union as sacred vessel, would seem to contradict each other in the years ahead. How do you preserve a union that includes slavery while also declaring slavery morally wrong? How do you restrict an evil without provoking the evil's defenders to destroy the nation? Lincoln didn't have all the answers yet, but he had the framework, the moral foundation, the philosophical architecture that would let him navigate the impossible choices ahead. He was 47 years old, a country lawyer who had stumbled back into politics because Stephen Douglas had awakened his conscience. He had no idea that in 6 years he would be president, that the philosophical framework he was building in Illinois courthouses and convention halls would be tested by the greatest crisis in American history. The reawakening was complete. Lincoln was back in politics, and this time he wouldn't leave until the question was settled. The quiet years were over. The storm he had felt gathering on the prairie was here now, and he was stepping into it with open eyes, armed with nothing but words and a moral certainty that slavery was wrong and the Union was worth saving. Whether that would be enough, only time would tell. On March the 6th, 1857, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down its decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford, and Lincoln must have felt like a man watching the ground collapse beneath his feet. Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing for the majority, declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, could never be citizens of the United States, that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional from the beginning. It was a judicial catastrophe, a constitutional endorsement of everything Lincoln had been fighting against. In one decision, the court had seemingly made it impossible to contain slavery's spread, had declared that the founding principles Lincoln held sacred, that all men are created equal, were simply wrong, or at least didn't apply to an entire race of human beings. Lincoln later said it seemed as though all the powers of earth were combining against anyone who opposed slavery's expansion. But Dred Scott did something else. It radicalized the North. Moderate Republicans who had been willing to compromise suddenly saw that the slave-holding South and its Democratic allies would not be satisfied with compromise. They wanted slavery recognized as a positive good, protected by the Constitution, expandable into every territory. The choice was becoming clear: resist now, or accept a nation half slave and half free forever. Lincoln spent 1857 and early 1858 speaking across Illinois, refining his response to Dred Scott, building his argument that the decision was wrong in law and morality. In June of 1858, Illinois Republicans gathered in Springfield and nominated Abraham Lincoln to run for the United States Senate against Stephen Douglas. On June 16, 1858, Lincoln stood before the Republican convention and delivered his acceptance speech. What came out of his mouth was so stark, so uncompromising, that even his political allies winced. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he said. "I believe this government cannot endure. Permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other." It was political suicide, or so his advisors thought. He was declaring that the compromises that had held the nation together were unsustainable, that the question of slavery would have to be settled decisively. Douglas and the Democrats immediately seized on it, claiming Lincoln was an abolitionist radical who wanted to start a war between the sections. But Lincoln knew exactly what he was doing. He was drawing a line, forcing a clarity that politicians had been avoiding for decades. Douglas, sensing danger, agreed to debate Lincoln across Illinois. 7 debates, 7 towns, 3 hours each, spread across August, September, and October of 1858. They became the most famous political debates in American history, a genuine clash of philosophies. Two brilliant men arguing about the fundamental nature of American democracy before audiences of thousands. The format was brutal. One speaker would talk for an hour. The other would respond for an hour and a half. Then the first would have 30 minutes to rebut. They spoke in open fields, in town squares, in blazing heat and autumn cold. Crowds came from miles around, turned it into a festival. The most exciting thing that had happened in these prairie towns in years. Douglas was a powerful speaker, confident and aggressive. He accused Lincoln of being a secret abolitionist, of wanting racial equality, of threatening the Union. He defended popular sovereignty as the democratic solution. Let each territory decide for itself. He mocked Lincoln's appearance, his backwoods origins, his lack of formal education. Lincoln was different. He was awkward at first, his high voice carrying oddly across the crowds, his angular body somehow both imposing and ungainly. But when he found his rhythm, when he began to build his argument piece by piece, he was devastating. He forced Douglas to defend the Dred Scott decision. He asked again and again whether slavery was right or wrong. He pointed out the moral bankruptcy of popular sovereignty, that allowing people to vote on whether to enslave other people was itself an admission that the enslaved were not people with rights. At Freeport, Illinois, in the second debate, Lincoln asked Douglas a question that seemed innocuous, but was actually a trap. Can the people of a United States territory, in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution? Douglas had to answer. If he said yes, he'd alienate Southern Democrats who believed Dred Scott guaranteed slavery's protection everywhere. If he said no, he'd alienate Northern Democrats who still believed in popular sovereignty. Douglas chose to save his Senate seat. He said yes. Territories could exclude slavery through unfriendly legislation, regardless of what the Supreme Court said. It became known as the Freeport Doctrine. Lincoln had gotten what he wanted. Douglas would win the Senate race, but he'd destroyed his chances of winning Southern support for a presidential run. Lincoln had sacrificed the immediate victory for a strategic advantage he might be able to use later. It was characteristic, the long view, the willingness to lose a battle to position himself for a war. The debates were covered by newspapers across the country. People who had never heard of Abraham Lincoln now knew his name, knew his arguments, knew that there was a Western lawyer who could match Stephen Douglas point for point. Lincoln became a national figure, not despite losing the Senate race, but because of how he lost it, with principles intact, arguments clear, a philosophy fully articulated. When the votes were counted in the legislature that November, Douglas won. Lincoln took the loss hard. This was his second defeat for the Senate, and he was 49 years old, an age when most men's political careers were ending rather than beginning. He wrote to a friend, "I now sink out of view and shall be forgotten." He was spectacularly wrong. The debates had made him the second most famous Republican in the country, after William Seward of New York. The House divided speech had given the party a moral framework that went beyond mere politics. Lincoln had articulated what the struggle was really about. Not just territories or popular sovereignty, but the fundamental question of whether America would live up to its founding promise, or become a nation permanently divided between freedom and slavery. Lincoln didn't know it yet, but he had done something extraordinary in those debates. He had lost the Senate race, but won a larger argument. He had established himself as the voice of Republican moderation, anti-slavery but not abolitionist, principled but not radical, willing to accept slavery where it existed, but determined to prevent its spread. And he had done it all while maintaining his reputation for honesty, for plain speaking, for being a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. The presidential election of 1860 was 2 years away. Lincoln would later claim he had no presidential ambitions, that he was just a country lawyer who had been drawn into politics by moral conviction. Maybe he even believed it. But the debates had positioned him perfectly, known enough to be taken seriously, not so prominent that he'd made powerful enemies, articulate enough to inspire the base, moderate enough not to terrify the middle. The House was divided, just as he'd said, and the man who had described the division so clearly was about to become the one forced to resolve it, to make it whole again, or watch it fall. The winter was coming, and with it a crisis that would test whether a nation conceived in liberty could long endure. On October the 16th, 1859, a wild-eyed abolitionist named John Brown led 18 men in a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was to seize weapons, arm the enslaved, and spark a general uprising that would sweep slavery from the South in blood and fire. The raid failed within 36 hours. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged on December the 2nd. But the damage was done. The South looked at John Brown and saw the face of Northern abolitionism, violent, uncompromising, willing to murder. The North looked at Brown's execution and the Southern celebration of it and saw a region so committed to slavery that it would hang a man for believing in the Declaration of Independence. The center was collapsing. Into this poisoned atmosphere stepped Abraham Lincoln, still just a former congressman and failed Senate candidate from Illinois, about to give a speech that would change everything. The invitation came from New York Republicans who wanted to hear this Western lawyer everyone was talking about. They scheduled him to speak at Cooper Union in Manhattan. Lincoln was 50 years old, largely unknown in the East. He had 4 months to prepare. He spent those months in research that would have impressed a doctoral candidate. He examined every scrap of evidence about the Founding Fathers' views on slavery, tracked down voting records, read through the records of the Constitutional Convention, built a case with the thoroughness of a lawyer preparing for the most important trial of his life. On February 27th, 1860, Lincoln walked onto the stage at Cooper Union, wearing a new black suit that didn't quite fit, his pants too short, his arms too long, his hair sticking up despite his best efforts. 1,500 New Yorkers had come to hear the prairie lawyer, and their first impression was probably unfavorable. He looked awkward, provincial, out of place. Then he began to speak. For 90 minutes, Lincoln dismantled the Southern argument that the Constitution protected slavery in the territories. He listed the Founding Fathers one by one. 21 of the 39 signers of the Constitution had voted on the question of federal power over slavery in the territories, and all 21 had voted to support that power. The founders believed Congress could restrict slavery. The Republican position wasn't radical. It was conservative, faithful to the original vision. Then he addressed the South directly, as though arguing with an opponent in court. "You charge that we stir up insurrections among your slaves. We deny it. And what is your proof? Harper's Ferry, John Brown." But John Brown was not a Republican, Lincoln pointed out. He was an outlaw who violated the law. No Republican endorsed his actions. Then he turned to his fellow Republicans with a message that was both warning and rallying cry. They must not compromise on the core principle that slavery was wrong and must not be permitted to spread. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it. Right makes might, not might makes right, the formula of tyrants, but right makes might. Moral clarity creates political power. The audience rose to its feet. The New York newspapers, skeptical of this Western rustic, declared it one of the greatest speeches ever delivered in the city. Lincoln spent the next few weeks touring New England, building his national profile. But he was careful. He didn't seek the nomination overtly. He positioned himself as everyone's second choice, not as prominent as William Seward of New York, not as radical as Salmon Chase of Ohio, but acceptable to all factions, available, safe, electable. The Republican Convention opened in Chicago on May 16, 1860, in a temporary wooden building called the Wigwam. Seward was the favorite. He had the money, the organization, the support of powerful party bosses. Lincoln was the dark horse from Illinois, the hometown candidate. But Lincoln's managers understood what Seward's didn't. The party needed someone who could win Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, the swing states of the Midwest. Seward was too well known, too radical. Lincoln was moderate enough to win these states, anti-slavery enough to satisfy the base, and untainted by corruption. On the third ballot, on May 18th, Abraham Lincoln secured the Republican nomination for president. The wigwam erupted. In Springfield, Lincoln waited at the telegraph office. When the news came, he walked home through the gathering twilight and found Mary in the parlor. "Mary," he said, "we are elected." Not nominated, elected, as though he could already see what was coming. The campaign that followed was strange by modern standards. Presidential candidates didn't campaign for themselves. It was considered undignified. Lincoln stayed in Springfield, greeting visitors, writing letters, saying as little as possible, because everything he said would be twisted by opponents. He had already said what needed saying. At Cooper Union, in the debates, in the House divided speech. Now silence was strategy. The Democratic Party split into northern and southern factions, each nominating its own candidate. Douglas represented the Northern Democrats, John Breckinridge the Southern. A fourth candidate, John Bell, ran on a platform of pretending the slavery question didn't exist. Lincoln watched the opposition fracture and knew that if he could hold the North, he would win. But with victory came menace. Letters arrived daily threatening his life. Southern newspapers declared that Lincoln's election would be cause for secession. Fire eaters in Charleston and Montgomery gave speeches promising disunion, promising war, promising that the South would never submit to a black Republican president. Lincoln read these threats and filed them away, saying little, his melancholy deepening. On November the 6th, 1860, Americans voted. Lincoln won every free state except New Jersey, which he split with Douglas. He didn't win a single slave state. In 10 southern states, his name didn't even appear on the ballot. But in the mathematics of the Electoral College, it didn't matter. Abraham Lincoln would be the 16th President of the United States. He had won with less than 40% of the popular vote, a plurality president in a divided nation. The South looked at the map and saw everything they had feared. The North had elected a president without Southern support, proving that the South no longer had the power to protect its interests within the Union. On December 20th, 1860, 6 weeks after the election, South Carolina voted to secede from the United States. Lincoln was still in Springfield, still just a president-elect with no power, watching the Union begin to dissolve before he could even take the oath of office. Other states would follow: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. 7 states gone by February, forming their own government, seizing federal property, raising armies. The House divided was finally falling, just as Lincoln had predicted. And the man who had described the crisis so clearly, who had argued that it could not endure permanently half slave and half free, was now responsible for saving what was left. Whether that was even possible, no one knew. He had 4 months until inauguration, 4 months to prepare for the greatest crisis in American history, 4 months before the promise he had made to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution would be tested by forces that wanted to destroy everything the Constitution represented. He sat in Springfield, grew his beard at the suggestion of a little girl who wrote him a letter, received visitors and delegations, and watched the country he had not yet begun to lead come apart at the seams. The waiting was almost over. The winter of 1860-1861 was the longest of Lincoln's life, and he spent it watching the United States disintegrate while he had no power to stop it. He was president-elect, which meant he had won the office but could not yet exercise its authority. James Buchanan, the outgoing president, wrung his hands and did nothing, declaring that while secession was illegal, the federal government had no power to prevent it. It was constitutional cowardice. Meanwhile, the southern states departed one by one. South Carolina went first, on December 20th, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. By February the 1st, 1861, 7 states had left the Union. They met in Montgomery, Alabama, formed the Confederate States of America, elected Jefferson Davis as president, and began seizing federal property: arsenals, mints, customs houses, forts. Everything except Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, where a small garrison held out under Major Robert Anderson, surrounded by Confederate batteries but still flying the American flag. Lincoln watched from Springfield and said almost nothing publicly. What could he say? He was not yet president. He had no authority to act, no power to negotiate, and part of him must have believed that saying the wrong thing now would only make matters worse. The South was waiting for an excuse to claim Lincoln had provoked them. But privately, in letters to political allies, Lincoln was clear. He would not compromise on the core principle. he would not agree to extending slavery into the territories. Some Republicans were panicking, proposing compromises that would have gutted everything the party stood for. Lincoln held firm. "Stand firm," he wrote to one nervous congressman. "The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter." On February 11th, 1861, Lincoln prepared to leave Springfield for Washington. He would never see his home again, though he couldn't have known that on the cold, rainy morning when he walked to the train station. 1,000 people had gathered to see him off, standing in the drizzle, silent and somber. Lincoln boarded the train, then stepped back onto the rear platform to say goodbye. What came out was not a political speech, but something rawer, more personal. "My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington." The crowd stood silent in the rain. Lincoln's voice broke. He concluded, "Without the assistance of that divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well." The train pulled away, carrying Lincoln toward Washington through a country that was no longer entirely his to govern. The journey took 12 days, a circuitous route designed to let Lincoln show himself to the northern states, to build support before he took office. At every stop, crowds gathered. Lincoln gave short speeches, careful ones, saying little of substance. But in Philadelphia, on February 22nd, speaking at Independence Hall, he reflected on the Declaration of Independence. "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence," he said. "The principle that all men are created equal, that was what the fight was about. If this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, I would rather be assassinated on this spot than surrender it." He meant it literally. That night, his advisors told him about a plot to assassinate him in Baltimore the next day. Detective Allan Pinkerton had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy. Lincoln would be attacked as he changed trains in Baltimore. The advisors urged him to take a night train secretly through Baltimore. Lincoln resisted. It felt cowardly, undignified, but his advisors insisted, and finally he agreed. On the night of February 22nd, Lincoln boarded a sleeper car in Philadelphia, wearing a soft felt hat instead of his distinctive stovepipe. They traveled through the night, passed through Baltimore, while his would-be assassins waited at the station, and arrived in Washington at dawn on February 23rd. The press had a field day. Cartoons showed Lincoln sneaking into Washington in disguise. The story made him look weak, fearful, unworthy of the office. Lincoln hated it, but he was in Washington now, and there was work to do. The inauguration was held on March the 4th, 1861, under threat of violence so credible that sharpshooters were positioned on rooftops and soldiers lined the route. Lincoln took the oath of office from Chief Justice Taney, the same Taney who had written the Dred Scott decision, and then delivered his first inaugural address. It was an attempt to reason with the unreasonable, to find words that might prevent war. "We are not enemies, but friends," Lincoln pleaded. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." He assured the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed, but he was equally clear that he would enforce the laws and hold federal property. And he ended with an appeal to shared history. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. It was beautiful. It was futile. The Confederacy had no intention of listening. They had already formed their own government, raised their own army, surrounded Fort Sumter with artillery. The only question was whether Lincoln would let them have the fort or try to resupply it. For a month, Lincoln agonized over Fort Sumter. The garrison was running out of food. If he resupplied the fort, it might provoke war. If he evacuated it, he would be acknowledging Confederate sovereignty, accepting disunion. His cabinet was divided. General Winfield Scott advised evacuation, but Lincoln kept coming back to the same question. If he surrendered federal property without a fight, what would be left of federal authority? He decided to resupply the fort with food only, no weapons or reinforcements, and to notify South Carolina of his intention. Let the Confederacy make the choice, allow humanitarian supplies, or open fire. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate batteries surrounding Fort Sumter opened fire. For 34 hours, they bombarded the fort with thousands of shells. Major Anderson and his garrison held out as long as they could, but it was hopeless. On April 13th, the fort surrendered. No one on either side was killed in the bombardment, but everything else had died. The possibility of peace, the hope of compromise, the Union as it had existed for 72 years. Lincoln received the news in Washington. The terrible certainty descended, the certainty he had been dreading, that the house divided would not stand, that it would become all one thing or all the other, and that the price of keeping it united would be paid in blood. On April the 15th, he called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. 4 more slave states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, immediately seceded rather than provide troops to fight against their fellow Southerners. The war had begun, and Lincoln, who had spent his life avoiding violence, who had never wanted to be a soldier, who had spent 3 months in the Black Hawk War without firing a shot, was now commander-in-chief of an army that would have to kill hundreds of thousands to save the Union he loved. The long winter was over. The war had come. Lincoln stood in the White House, looking out at Washington, at the Potomac River beyond, at Virginia on the far shore now in Confederate hands, and felt the weight of what he had inherited. He had won the presidency to prevent the spread of slavery. Now he would have to fight a war to prevent the destruction of the nation itself. Whether he was equal to the task, he didn't know. But the choice had been made, or rather, the choice had been taken from him by the guns of Charleston Harbor. The terrible work was beginning. Abraham Lincoln became commander-in-chief. knowing almost nothing about military strategy. He had served 3 months in the Black Hawk War without seeing combat. He had read a few books on military tactics. That was the sum of his martial education. Now he was responsible for directing armies, appointing generals, making decisions that would determine whether men lived or died. He taught himself. Late at night, while the White House slept, Lincoln would sit in his office reading books on military strategy, borrowed from the Library of Congress. He studied maps until he could visualize terrain he'd never seen. He learned about lines of supply and interior lines and the difference between strategy and tactics. He had to, because the generals he had inherited didn't seem to know how to fight this new kind of war. In July of 1861, 3 months into his presidency, the Union Army marched toward Richmond with all the confidence of untested troops led by untested commanders. The public demanded action. "On to Richmond," the newspapers screamed. On July the 21st, at a creek called Bull Run, near Manassas, Virginia, the Union Army met Confederate forces in the first major battle of the war. Washington society had treated it like entertainment. Congressmen and their wives rode out from the city in carriages, bringing picnic baskets and opera glasses. They wanted to watch the rebels get whipped. Instead, they witnessed disaster. The Confederate line held, then counterattacked. The Union Army broke and ran, soldiers fleeing in panic back toward Washington, mixing with the terrified civilians, the whole mass streaming back to the Capitol in chaos and shame. Lincoln received the news that night. The Union Army had been routed. The road to Washington lay open. Lincoln spent that night preparing for siege, wondering if his presidency would end after 4 months. But the Confederates didn't pursue. They had been as disorganized in victory as the Union had been in defeat. Bull Run taught Lincoln that this would not be a short war, that he needed better generals and better plans. He appointed George McClellan to command the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was 34 years old, a West Point graduate, brilliant at organization and training. The soldiers loved him. He built the Army of the Potomac into a formidable fighting force. But McClellan wouldn't fight. He drilled his troops and demanded more men and more supplies and more time. He was preparing, always preparing, for a campaign that never quite materialized. Lincoln grew increasingly frustrated. "If General McClellan does not want to use the army," Lincoln said, "I would like to borrow it for a time." The joke masked genuine anguish. Men were dying in smaller engagements. The Confederacy was consolidating, and McClellan sat outside Washington with the finest army on the continent and did nothing. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Lincoln like a physical burden. His face aged years in months. The melancholy that had always shadowed him deepened into something darker. And then, in February of 1862, Willie Lincoln fell ill. Willie was 11 years old, the son who was most like his father, gentle, bookish, thoughtful. He and his younger brother Tad had caught typhoid fever, probably from the contaminated water supply that fed the White House. Tad recovered. Willie did not. For 2 weeks, Lincoln and Mary kept vigil at Willie's bedside while the war continued around them. Lincoln would spend hours with his dying son, then return to his office to review casualty reports from other people's dying sons. Mary barely left Willie's room. She sat by his bed, held his hand, talked to him even when he could no longer respond. On February the 20th, 1862, at 5 in the afternoon, Willie died. Lincoln broke. He went into Willie's room, looked at the small body and said, "My poor boy. He was too good for this earth. God has called him home. I know that he is much better off in heaven. But then we loved him so. It is hard to have him die." Then he walked into his office, locked the door, and wept with a violence that terrified the staff who heard him through the walls. Mary's grief was worse, if worse is even the right word. She collapsed entirely, took to her bed, couldn't attend the funeral. For months afterward, she would barely function. She held seances in the White House, trying to contact Willie's spirit. She would go into his room and scream his name. She spent money compulsively, ordering dresses and jewelry she didn't need, as though buying things could fill the void. Lincoln watched his wife lose her mind to grief and could do nothing. Tad, 8 years old, became his father's constant shadow. The boy had lost his brother and was terrified of losing anyone else. He slept in Lincoln's bed when nightmares struck. He followed his father through the White House, interrupting meetings, demanding attention. Lincoln indulged him completely, let him do anything, as though by protecting Tad, he could somehow make up for failing to save Willie. Robert, the eldest, was away at Harvard. He wrote dutiful letters of condolence, but remained emotionally distant, as he had been for years. The gap between Robert and his father had never closed. Now Willie was gone, and that gap felt permanent. The war continued. It didn't stop for grief. In the spring of 1862, McClellan finally moved his army by sea to the Virginia Peninsula, planning to approach Richmond from the southeast. For weeks, Lincoln watched McClellan creep toward the Confederate capital, always finding reasons to halt, always demanding more troops, always seeing enemy forces that didn't exist. The Peninsula Campaign ended in failure. McClellan retreating with his magnificent army intact, but useless. And through all of this, Lincoln was thinking about slavery. He had come to office determined to prevent its spread, but accepting its existence where it already was. But the war was changing his calculation. Slavery was the source of Confederate strength. Enslaved people grew the food, built the fortifications, freed white men to fight. If Lincoln could strike at slavery, he could strike at the rebellion's foundation. More than that, the moral imperative was becoming impossible to ignore. Union soldiers were dying to preserve a union that protected slavery. Black men and women were fleeing to Union lines, offering their labor, their loyalty, their willingness to fight. How long could Lincoln fight a war to preserve the Union while ignoring the institution that had caused the fracture? He began drafting a proclamation in his spare moments, working on it in the War Department telegraph office, where he went to read battlefield reports. He showed it to no one at first. It was too radical, too risky. His cabinet would be divided. Border states might secede. Northern Democrats would howl. But the logic was becoming inescapable. Military necessity and moral duty were converging. Willie's death had changed something in Lincoln. Not his commitment to the Union, that was already absolute, but his willingness to make the war about more than just reunion. His son had died for nothing, an accident of contaminated water. But the hundreds of thousands who would die in this war, their deaths had to mean something. They had to purchase something beyond a return to the status quo. They had to create a new birth of freedom. Or what was the point of all the blood? By summer of 1862, Lincoln had made his decision. He would issue an Emancipation Proclamation. He was waiting for the right moment, a Union victory, something to make it seem like strength rather than desperation. The victory was slow in coming, but the decision was made. The war that had begun as a fight to preserve the Union was about to become something larger, more dangerous, more transformative. Lincoln was learning generalship the hard way, through defeats and dead sons and sleepless nights. But he was learning something else too, that this war could not end with the country as it had been before, that Willie's death and all the deaths to come demanded a transformation, that the house divided would have to become all one thing, and he would make it all free or die trying. On September the 17th, 1862, near a creek called Antietam in Maryland, the Union and Confederate armies collided in the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing by nightfall. The cornfields ran red. Bodies were stacked like cordwood. It was carnage beyond anything America had ever witnessed. But it was also, technically, a Union victory. Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North had been stopped. The Confederate Army retreated back across the Potomac into Virginia. It wasn't the decisive triumph Lincoln had hoped for. McClellan had failed to pursue and destroy Lee's damaged army. But it was enough. It was the victory Lincoln had been waiting for. On September 22nd, 1862, 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln called his cabinet together. He began by reading them a chapter from a humorous book by Artemus Ward. The cabinet sat in confused silence, wondering why the president was wasting their time with comedy. Then Lincoln set the book aside, his face becoming serious, and said he had something important to share. He read them the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that on January the 1st, 1863, all persons held as slaves in states still in rebellion would be forever free. It was a war measure, Lincoln explained, justified by military necessity. It would deprive the Confederacy of slave labor. It would allow black men to enlist in Union armies. It would transform the war from a fight to preserve the Union into a fight for human freedom. The cabinet was divided. Some thought it was too radical, would cost support in the border states. Others thought it didn't go far enough. Lincoln listened to their objections, but his mind was made up. "I have thought about this for weeks," he said. "The time has come." The proclamation was published the next day. The reaction was explosive. Abolitionists celebrated, though some complained it was too limited. Northern Democrats howled that Lincoln had changed the war's purpose. The border states trembled. The Confederacy declared it proof of what they'd always said. Lincoln was a radical bent on destroying Southern society. Lincoln spent the fall of 1862 waiting for January 1st, knowing that on that day he would have to make good on his promise. There were enormous pressures to back down, to modify the proclamation. Lincoln refused. He had said he would do it, and he would do it. On New Year's Day, 1863, Lincoln held the traditional White House reception, shaking hands with hundreds of visitors for 3 hours. By the time it ended and he went to his office to sign the final Emancipation Proclamation, his right hand was so swollen and numb that he could barely hold a pen. "I never felt more certain I was doing right," he said to the officials gathered to witness the signing. "But if I sign with a trembling hand, posterity will say, 'He hesitated.'" He waited a moment for the trembling to subside, then signed in a firm, clear hand. Abraham Lincoln. The Emancipation Proclamation was not poetry. It was a legal document, dry and technical. Lincoln himself admitted it had no leeway for flourishes. But what it lacked in eloquence, it made up for in consequences. With the stroke of a pen, Lincoln had declared 3.5 million people free. It didn't immediately free all of them. It only applied to areas in rebellion. But it changed everything. It made the war irrevocably about slavery. It invited black men to take up arms for their own liberation. Lincoln understood what he had done. He told a friend, "I never, in my life, felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." The war ground on through 1863. Then came July and Gettysburg. For 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd, the Union and Confederate armies tore each other apart in Pennsylvania. It was the largest battle ever fought in North America. 165,000 men engaged, 51,000 casualties. Pickett's charge on the third day saw Confederate soldiers marching across open ground into Union artillery and rifle fire, a slaughter so complete that the assault collapsed before it reached the Union lines. Lee retreated. The invasion of the North had failed. Lincoln was frustrated that General Meade didn't pursue and destroy Lee's army, but Gettysburg was still a turning point. Combined with the fall of Vicksburg on July 4th, which gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, July 1863, marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. In November, a cemetery was dedicated at Gettysburg for the Union dead. The main speaker was Edward Everett, the most famous orator in America, who spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln was invited almost as an afterthought, asked to deliver a few appropriate remarks. Lincoln took the assignment seriously. He worked on his speech for weeks, trying to find the words that would explain what the dead had died for, what the war meant, what the nation was becoming. On November 19, 1863, he stood before the crowd at Gettysburg and spoke for 2 minutes. 77 years ago, he began, "Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." He didn't mention slavery. He didn't mention the Emancipation Proclamation. He didn't need to. By dating the nation's founding to 1776 and the Declaration of Independence, rather than 1787 and the Constitution, he was redefining what America meant. The Declaration said all men are created equal. The Constitution had accommodated slavery. Lincoln was choosing the Declaration, declaring that equality was the nation's founding principle, and this war was testing whether a nation dedicated to that principle could survive. The dead at Gettysburg had given their lives so that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people by the people for the people shall not perish from the earth. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, Lincoln said, but it can never forget what they did here. He was wrong about the first part. spectacularly wrong. The Gettysburg Address became the most quoted speech in American history, memorized by generations of school children, carved into marble. In 272 words, Lincoln had transformed the Civil War from a struggle to preserve the Union into a fight for a new birth of freedom. Not just the Union, but democracy itself, the idea that people could govern themselves, the experiment that the whole world was watching. Edward Everett wrote to Lincoln afterward, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Lincoln had found the words. He had explained what they were fighting for in a way that transcended politics and strategy, that made the war about human freedom and democratic possibility. It was everything he had been working toward since that night in New Orleans when he'd seen enslaved people on auction blocks and promised himself that if he ever got the chance to hit that thing, he would hit it hard. The proclamation and the address together formed Lincoln's answer to the question that had haunted him since his House-divided speech. How do you preserve the Union while opposing slavery? You transform the Union into something worth preserving, something based on equality rather than compromise with bondage. You make the war about freedom so that victory means not just reunion, but redemption. The fighting wasn't over. The bloodiest battles were still ahead. But Lincoln had done something extraordinary. He had given the war a meaning that would outlast the battles, had articulated a vision of America that would echo through history. The boy who had seen slave coffles on Kentucky roads, who had taught himself to read by firelight, who had walked 6 miles to borrow grammar books, had grown into the man who could reshape the nation's understanding of itself in 272 words. The house divided was being rebuilt, and this time it would be built on the foundation of freedom, or it wouldn't be built at all. In March of 1864, Abraham Lincoln found the general he had been searching for since the war began. Ulysses S. Grant had won victories in the West, at Fort Donelson, at Vicksburg, at Chattanooga, while Eastern generals had made excuses. Grant was different. He understood that the war would be won not through brilliant maneuvers, but through relentless pressure, that the Union's advantages in men and material meant nothing if those advantages weren't used. Lincoln brought him east, made him general-in-chief, and told him to win the war. Grant did not look like a military genius. He was short, slouched, often wore a private's uniform. He drank too much when idle, had failed at everything before the war. But he had one quality that all of Lincoln's previous generals had lacked. He would fight. He would accept casualties that would have made McClellan retreat. He would lose battles and attack again the next day. In May of 1864, Grant launched the Overland Campaign, driving toward Richmond through the Virginia wilderness. The Battle of the Wilderness was a horror. 2 days of fighting in dense forest, the wounded burning to death in fires started by muzzle flashes, 60,000 casualties. Previous Union generals would have retreated after such losses. Grant ordered his army to move south, toward Richmond. The Army of the Potomac cheered when they realized they were advancing, not retreating. But the cost was staggering. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. Each battle added thousands more names to the casualty lists. In 1 month, Grant's army suffered 55,000 casualties, nearly as many as in the previous 3 years combined. Newspapers called him the the butcher. Lincoln received letters from mothers who had lost sons, wives who had lost husbands, all blaming him for appointing Grant, for continuing the war. Lincoln bore it all: the criticism, the hatred, the knowledge that every order he confirmed sent more men to die. But he supported Grant because Grant understood what needed to be done and had the will to do it. "I can't spare this man," Lincoln said. "He fights." The war was killing Lincoln as surely as it was killing the soldiers. Photographs from 1864 show a man transformed by suffering. The face that had been weathered but vigorous in 1861 was now gaunt, lined, aged beyond its 55 years. His eyes carried a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion into something spiritual. People who saw him up close were shocked by how old he looked, how bent, as though he were carrying the weight of all the dead. He felt every death personally, made himself read the casualty reports, visited hospitals where the wounded lay in rows that seemed to stretch forever. He couldn't save them, couldn't bring back the dead. All he could do was ensure their deaths meant something. The election of 1864 approached with victory still uncertain. Lincoln expected to lose. Grant was bogged down at Petersburg. Sherman was advancing toward Atlanta, but hadn't taken it yet. The country was exhausted, sick of war. The Democratic candidate, George McClellan, ran on a peace platform, promising to end the war even if it meant accepting disunion. Lincoln prepared to hand over power. He wrote a blind memorandum, sealed it, asked his cabinet to sign the back without reading it. Inside, he had written that it seemed likely he would not be re-elected, and therefore it would be his duty to cooperate with the incoming president to save the Union before inauguration. Then Atlanta fell. On September the 2nd, 1864, Sherman telegraphed, "Atlanta is ours," and fairly won. The news electrified the North. Suddenly, victory seemed possible. When soldiers voted, they voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln, rejecting McClellan despite his former popularity. They were voting to see the war through to victory, to make their sacrifices mean something. Lincoln won decisively. On election night, he reflected on what it meant. "It is best for you that I should be elected," he told a gathering. Not best for him, best for the country, because changing leadership mid-war could be disastrous. By March of 1865, the war's end was finally in sight. Grant had Petersburg under siege. Sherman had marched to the sea, devastated Georgia, was now moving north through the Carolinas. The Confederacy was collapsing. On March the 4th, 1865, Lincoln stood on the Capitol steps to deliver his second inaugural address. It was short, just 703 words, but it may have been the greatest speech of his life. He didn't celebrate impending victory or condemn the defeated enemy. Instead, he meditated on the meaning of the war, on how both sides had prayed to the same God, read the same Bible, claimed divine favor. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has His own purposes. Perhaps Lincoln suggested the war was God's punishment for the sin of slavery, punishment not just of the South, but of the entire nation that had tolerated it. If God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. So still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. But he ended not with judgment, but with mercy, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. It was prophetic, as though Lincoln could see what was coming, not just victory, but the hard work of reconciliation, of rebuilding a nation torn apart. He was preparing the country for peace, for the moral complexity of what came after, for the work of binding wounds that might never fully heal. On April the 3rd, 1865, Richmond fell. The Confederate government fled. The next day, Lincoln walked through the streets of the conquered capital with his son Tad and a small military escort. Former slaves recognized him, surrounded him, some of them falling to their knees in gratitude and reverence. Lincoln stopped them. "Don't kneel to me," he said. "That is not right. You must kneel only to God and thank him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." It was the culmination of everything. The boy who had seen slave coffles in Kentucky, who had promised to hit that thing hard if he ever got the chance, was now walking through Richmond, telling the newly freed to kneel only to God. The proclamation he had signed with a trembling hand was becoming reality. The house divided was becoming all one thing, and that thing was free. Lincoln walked through Richmond streets, exhausted beyond measure, aged beyond his years, carrying sorrows that would have broken smaller men. But he had done it. The war was almost over. The Union would survive. Slavery was dying. In a few more days, Lee would surrender to Grant at Appomattox. The terrible work would be finished. He took a carriage ride with Mary on the afternoon of April 14th, Good Friday. "We must both be more cheerful in the future," he told her. "Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable." The war was ending. Perhaps there could be peace now, not just for the nation, but for his own tormented soul. Lincoln didn't know that he had only hours left to live. Abraham Lincoln woke on April the 14th, 1865, Good Friday, from a dream he had experienced several times before. He told his cabinet about it later that morning. In the dream, he was in a boat, moving rapidly toward a dark, indefinite shore. The dream always came before important events, he said. Before Antietam, before Gettysburg, before other turning points. This time, he believed it meant good news was coming from Sherman's army in North Carolina. The cabinet meeting that morning was optimistic, almost jubilant. Lee had surrendered 5 days earlier at Appomattox. The war was essentially over. The question now was reconstruction. How to bring the rebellious states back into the Union. How to treat the defeated enemy. How to build a peace worthy of the war's terrible cost. Lincoln's position was clear. Generosity. No hangings, no mass imprisonments, no vindictive punishments. We must extinguish our resentments if we expect harmony and union, he said. He wanted the Southern states restored to the Union as quickly as possible. Some cabinet members wanted harsher measures. Lincoln held firm. Enough blood had been spilled. The work now was binding up the nation's wounds. After the cabinet meeting, Lincoln worked through routine business. He seemed in good spirits, more relaxed than he had been in months. The weight that had pressed down on him for 4 years was finally lifting. The war was over. The Union was saved. Perhaps now there could be rest. In the afternoon, Lincoln took Mary for a carriage ride, just the two of them. They rode through Washington, past the Capitol, out into the countryside, where they could see spring flowers blooming. Mary later remembered it as one of the happiest times they had shared in years. Lincoln talked about the future, about what they would do when his presidency ended. Perhaps they would travel, see California, maybe go abroad. "We must both be more cheerful in the future," he told her. "Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable." Mary agreed. The worst was over. They could begin to heal now. That evening, they planned to attend Ford's Theater to see a comedy called Our American Cousin. Lincoln didn't particularly want to go. He was tired, but they had advertised his attendance, and he felt obliged to appear. Mary invited a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris, to join them in the presidential box. They arrived at Ford's Theater at 8:30. The orchestra struck up, "Hail to the Chief." The audience rose, applauding, turning to look at the tall, gaunt figure making his way to the flag-draped box. Lincoln acknowledged the applause, then sat in a rocking chair, positioned so he could see the stage. The play resumed. Our American Cousin was a farce, light comedy that audiences loved. Lincoln laughed along with the crowd, enjoying the absurdity, letting himself relax for the first time in years. Mary sat beside him, holding his hand. At one point, she whispered, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" Lincoln replied, "She won't think anything about it." In the dim hallway outside the presidential box, John Wilkes Booth waited. He was 26 years old, a famous actor, and he was about to commit the most notorious murder in American history. Booth was a Southern sympathizer, enraged by the Confederacy's defeat, convinced that killing Lincoln would somehow avenge the South's humiliation. At 10:15 p.m., during the third act, Booth entered the box. The guard, who should have been stationed outside, had wandered off. Booth knew the play well, knew that a particular line was coming that always got a huge laugh. He waited for that moment, when the laughter would mask the sound of the shot. The line came, the audience roared, and Booth raised his derringer and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. Lincoln slumped forward, unconscious instantly. Mary screamed. Booth leaped from the box onto the stage, catching his spur on the flag and breaking his leg in the fall. But he rose, turned to the audience, and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Then he limped off the stage and disappeared into the night. The theater erupted into chaos. Doctors in the audience rushed to the presidential box. They found Lincoln unconscious, barely breathing, blood flowing from the wound in his head. They examined him and knew instantly the wound was mortal. Lincoln would not survive. They couldn't move him far. 6 men carried Lincoln across the street to a boarding house owned by William Peterson. They took him to a back bedroom and laid him diagonally across a bed too short for his frame. Doctors worked through the night, but there was nothing they could do. The bullet had torn through Lincoln's brain. They could only wait for the end. Mary came in twice, collapsing both times at the sight of him. "Live! You must live!" she screamed, shaking him as though she could wake him through sheer force of will. They took her to the front parlor, where her screams echoed through the house. She would never fully recover from this night. At the White House, Tad Lincoln learned that his father had been shot. "They killed Papa dead," he wailed. "They killed Papa dead." The boy who had lost his brother Willie, who had clung to his father through all the war years, was now losing the only parent he felt truly close to. Through the night, cabinet members and generals and politicians crowded into the small boarding house room, watching Lincoln die by inches. His breathing grew more labored, more irregular. Sometimes it stopped entirely, and they thought he was gone, only to hear him draw another shuddering breath. He never regained consciousness, never spoke, never showed any sign of awareness. He just lay there, impossibly long in that too-short bed, slowly leaving them. Sometime before dawn, it began to rain. A cold April rain, just like the rain that had fallen in Springfield when Lincoln left for Washington 4 years earlier. The rain drummed on the roof of the Peterson house, on the street where the silent crowd stood vigil, on the city that was about to lose the man who had saved it. In the small bedroom, crowded with witnesses, Abraham Lincoln fought for his last breaths. Outside, dawn was breaking over Washington. The rain fell harder, and the man who had preserved the Union, who had freed 4 million enslaved people, who had given the war a meaning that transcended mere politics, was breathing his last in a stranger's bed. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood near the foot of the bed. The man who had once mocked Lincoln as an ape, who now loved him with the fierce devotion of one who had witnessed greatness up close. He waited, watching, ready to speak the words that would mark the end. The vigil would end at 7:22 a.m. with Stanton's pronouncement. Now he belongs to the ages. But Lincoln had already left them, had already embarked on that journey from his dream, the ship moving rapidly toward a dark and indefinite shore. The boy from the Kentucky wilderness, who had taught himself to read by firelight, who had walked 6 miles to borrow books, who had promised to hit slavery hard if he ever got the chance. He was gone, and America would wake on April 15th, 1865, to discover that it had lost the man who had remade it, on the very day it was meant to celebrate resurrection. The funeral train left Washington on April 21st, 1865, carrying Abraham Lincoln's body on a journey of 1,654 miles through 7 states to Springfield, Illinois. It was the reverse of his inaugural journey 4 years earlier, but everything had changed. The man who had traveled to Washington in secret, fearing assassination, now traveled home in a coffin, the assassination accomplished. The nation he had left divided was now reunited, but at a cost no one could have imagined. The train moved slowly, stopping in cities along the way: Baltimore, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, Chicago. At each stop, Lincoln's body lay in state while thousands filed past. In some cities, 100,000 people came. They waited for hours in lines that stretched for miles just to glimpse the coffin. But it was between the cities that the mourning revealed its true depth. Millions lined the railroad tracks, farmers leaving their fields, families traveling miles from remote homes, entire communities gathering at crossroads. They stood in silence as the train passed, holding candles, singing hymns, weeping openly. At night, bonfires blazed on hilltops, creating a corridor of light through the darkness, guiding Lincoln home. On May the 4th, 1865, 20 days after his death, Abraham Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield. He had come home at last to the town where he had practiced law, raised his family, launched his political career. Willie's body was moved from Washington to be buried with him. The family that had been scattered by ambition and war would be reunited in death. The canonization was immediate and almost total. Lincoln, who had been the most hated president in American history, reviled by the South as a tyrant, criticized by the North as too slow or too radical, became overnight the most revered. His murder on Good Friday, his years of suffering for the nation's sins, his final act of mercy, cut short by violence, it all seemed too perfectly tragic, too perfectly Christ-like to be mere history. The mythology making began before his body was cold. The story of Log Cabin to White House, the rail splitter who became president, the self-taught prairie lawyer who saved the nation. These stories were told and retold until Lincoln became less a man than a symbol. Honest Abe, Father Abraham, the great emancipator. He became what each generation needed him to be. His complexity smoothed away into marble perfection. But Lincoln's legacy would be contested from the moment of his death. The South he had wanted to treat with charity was instead subjected to Reconstruction, which eventually failed, giving way to Jim Crow, to the systematic re-enslavement of Black Americans through laws and terror. Lincoln's words about equality were cited by those fighting for civil rights and by those opposing them. He became a weapon in arguments he never lived to see. Through the decades after his death, as the promise of emancipation withered, Lincoln's unfinished work remained unfinished. The freedmen he had liberated were abandoned to a century of oppression. The new birth of freedom he had proclaimed at Gettysburg was stillborn, or at least placed in a coma from which it would not wake for generations. But the words remained. The Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural, the Emancipation Proclamation, they remained as promises unfulfilled, as standards against which the nation could be judged and found wanting. When the civil rights movement emerged in the 1950s and 1960s, it was to Lincoln's words that activists turned. Martin Luther King Jr. began his "I Have a Dream" speech standing in Lincoln's shadow at the Lincoln Memorial. 50 years ago, King began, consciously echoing Gettysburg, reminding America that the promises made during the Civil War remained unredeemed. The Lincoln Memorial itself, dedicated in 1922, had become a temple to American possibility and American failure in equal measure. Built like a Greek temple, with Lincoln seated like Zeus gazing toward the Capitol, it was magnificent and slightly absurd, a prairie lawyer made into a god. But it also became a site of conscience, a place where the gap between American ideals and American reality could be confronted. Marian Anderson sang there in 1939 after being barred from Constitution Hall because of her race. King spoke there in 1963. Today, more than 150 years after his death, the arguments about Lincoln continue. Was he the great emancipator, or a reluctant pragmatist who freed the slaves only when military necessity demanded it? Was he a champion of equality, or a man of his time who couldn't imagine true racial integration? Did he save the Union, or create a federal power beyond what the founders intended? Each generation answers differently, finding in Lincoln's words whatever they need to support their vision of America. Perhaps that's as it should be. Lincoln himself was a man of contradictions, melancholic but funny, ambitious but humble, politically shrewd but morally principled. He preserved the Union by remaking it, saved the Constitution by stretching it, ended slavery while holding views on race that would be unacceptable today. He was neither saint nor tyrant, but something more interesting. A man trying to navigate impossible choices with imperfect knowledge. The cost of preserving the Union was 620,000 dead. The price of ending slavery was paid in blood beyond calculation, and Lincoln knew, or seemed to know, that he would not live to see the peace he had fought for. His melancholy prescience, that sense of doom that shadowed him all his life, had prepared him for the end even as he worked to prevent it. In the Peterson house, in that too-short bed, Lincoln's impossible frame had been forced to curl, to bend, just as it had bent throughout his life, to fit into spaces not made for him. The boy from the wilderness, too tall for doorways, too strange for convention, too thoughtful for politics, had somehow grown into the role history demanded. And when the work was finished, and the Union saved, and slavery destroyed, he was taken away on Good Friday, at the moment of victory. Now he belongs to the ages, Edwin Stanton had said. He meant it as eulogy, as acknowledgement that Lincoln had transcended his moment to become something permanent in the American story. But it also meant something else, that Lincoln no longer belonged to himself, to his family, to his friends. He belonged to history now, to be used and misused, claimed and disclaimed, celebrated and contested by every generation. The house he had said could not stand divided had been reunited, but the divisions remained deeper than walls, more permanent than politics. Lincoln, who had predicted that the house would become all one thing or all the other, had succeeded only partially. The house stood. Slavery died. But the work of creating a nation truly dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal remained unfinished, remains unfinished still. Perhaps that's his real legacy. Not that he solved America's contradictions, but that he gave us the language to keep struggling with them, the vision to imagine something better, and the example of how much one person can accomplish when guided by principle and willing to pay the price. The rain fell on the Peterson house that April morning. The ship reached its dark shore, and Abraham Lincoln, who had preserved the Union and freed the slaves and given words to the American promise, finally rested from his labors. The work remained, but he had done enough, more than enough. He belongs to the ages now, and the ages have not finished with him yet. The boy who learned to read by firelight, who walked 6 miles to borrow books, who promised to hit slavery hard if he ever got the chance. He kept his promise, and in keeping it, he transformed a nation and gave meaning to suffering that might otherwise have been simply waste. The long journey from the Kentucky wilderness to the Peterson house was over. The melancholy that had shadowed him had finally lifted, and somewhere, perhaps, Willie was waiting.